How do we get a grip on violent crime in South Africa? This is, of course, following the release of the latest crime stats. So let's focus on that discussion. We focus on fighting against gender-based violence and femicide, as well as safeguarding the rights of people against violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender equality. Well, as we head towards 16 days of activism, gender-based violence continues to be an ongoing plight in this country, unfortunately. Well, let's have this conversation. We're joined now by Steve Letsike, who is Executive Director for Access Chapter 2, as well as Sharon Cox, who is the Health and Services Manager at Triangle Project. Good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us, Steve. I think I want to start with you and just talk a little bit about what you made of those crime stats yesterday when we saw the police minister announcing them, and the fact that violent crime continues to worsen in the country. We've seen numbers that are the worst we've seen in 5 years in South Africa.
No, indeed. Thank you so much for inviting us to this space. Look, I really do think, it's expected that we are facing so much violence in our country. I think the most fundamental thing is, what do we do to prevent and also to respond to this violence? I think we have to realize that the history of prejudice, the history of violence has always been embedded in our community. How we actually have come to a point to then say our state has to be empowered to really deal with some of these violent acts that are perpetrated in community. By the way, violence predominantly is affecting women, it's affecting children, it's affecting LGBTI persons, but it's also affecting men for that matter. So that historic element that takes the context of gender, but that also takes the context of sexual orientation, right, and all other issues are really becoming a problem. So what we are doing is really what we need to be talking about to prevent and also to respond to violence in South Africa.
I want to talk about the prevention, but I think that that's a bigger project, right? And it certainly is something that we really need to be investing in. But we're struggling just with prosecuting violent crime in South Africa, particularly where gender-based violence is concerned. We're struggling in that area. Let's talk about where those loopholes are, where the opportunities are to start really plugging them and having some impact, because there's lots of talk around justice for victims of gender-based violence, but very little results that we are seeing.
Yeah, I think we have to acknowledge that progressively we are a country with a very clear constitution, with very clear policies, and even with the recent amendment of gender-based violence bills, the Children's Act, and so forth. And of course, what we lack is making sure that the hate crime legislation is in place. So with these progressive and comprehensive laws that give recognition and the idea of protection to the fundamental rights is what we have really been looking forward and yearning as South Africans, to exercise and practicalize these laws and legislation. But experience has really been a challenging one. And part of it is the justice element, that no matter how much extensive effort is put, justice seems to be taking time, seems to be super expensive now, but also seems to be denied to some elements, and more also favoring, the perpetrators in other times. So we have actually not realized justice as a lived experience for many people. And I think that's the most highest level of injustice that we are seeing in our country. So I think we need to really deal with it, not only just at the level of court, but it also has to do with the process that gets us to justice. What happens with South African police services? Are we still going to be experiencing secondary victimization? Are we still going to be, not having trust with the system itself? But also, are we going to be dealing with it from society, the cultural attitude and some of the codes that perpetrate this violence act that may not even lead to justice elements?
I want to talk a little bit about what you've mentioned now, but what happens in the process, right? What happens at the police station, for instance, secondary victimization and the cultural norms and thinkings that we have and how they impact access to justice. It's a difficult one when we look at the situation and the challenges faced by the LGBTIQ plus community in South Africa, because where someone who is perhaps not gender normative is a victim of violence, goes into a police station asking for assistance, they might very well be asked first, what are you? Before they are given assistance. And we need to actually maybe start having a discussion about, do we first need to start having a general educational program where we talk about gender identity and sexual orientation in the country?
You see, we have a history where we had a policy through the Public Service Administration around a policy called mainstreaming, that we actually want to mainstream gender. We need to sensitize public officials. Where services matters, there must be mainstreaming. And also the principle of Batupili. So actually what we should not be tolerating, in our system is intolerance. We should not be tolerating it. We should also not be tolerating lack of competence in servicing people equally. Yes. And I don't think we should be entertaining this, not in 2022, where we have done so much, where even our government have ensured policies that enables officials to do their work. Where there's lack of incompetence, we must actually get rid of it so that it does not prohibit that. Now, the issue is whether culture, society has played a role in really advancing stigma and discrimination, and those attitudes that we're seeing, people actually going to the system with their own personal views of what constitutes LGBTI. Any person that comes to service must be served. It does not matter whether they are gay, whether they are heterosexual, and so forth. And I think these are ways where we need to prevent vulnerability that is caused even by officials for that matter. And I think we've raised this a number of times, and it's unacceptable for us to even today talk about it. What we have done as member of the National Task Team was to set up rapid response team when LGBTI cases are reported. The entity of justice takes these matters forward, but through NGOs and through other SAPS as well as NPA. But it's not enough because it's not implemented everywhere and it's not as effective everywhere, right?
Yeah, and you're not reaching everyone. Yeah, I want to squeeze one last question. Yeah, I want to squeeze one last question in, Steve, before I let you go. And this is what we started with at the beginning. You wanted to talk about prevention, and I think that's more important, or equally important, as access to justice. What does prevention of gender-based violence, whether it be against women, children, or the LGBTIQ community, what does that prevention even look like?
Look, I think first we need to change the behavior in society. So we need to thoroughly implement social behavior change in society, deal with toxic masculinity, deal with toxic society. That also puts men at the level of harm towards others. We need to respond to all these challenges. But at the same time, people in society cannot be bystanders, because when we see violence, at least historically, what we knew growing up in a township, no matter the violence that was caused by apartheid, but there would not be rape, there would not be violence in society. We would watch it, we will report it, we will also respond and actually tend to attend to the person who is perpetrating violence in society. Those things were not tolerated. So by the time you deal with the system, because police only responds after the act has been perpetrated. It's not happening in police station, it's happening in society. So the magnitude of it is dealing with that. Secondly, let's deal with inequality. Let's deal with poverty, because these are issues that people are sitting there, they are hungry, their mental health is in a different level. They get to substance use and abuse. We must deal with the substance of societal issues and not disconnect them, because those are some of the acts that contribute to it. So for me, let's deal with inequality, let's deal with poverty, let's deal with unemployment in our country.
Let's deal with the drivers of it. Steve, an absolute pleasure speaking to you, and thank you so much for your time. That there, Steve Letsike, talking to us about the fight against gender-based violence and femicide. And of course, Steve is Executive Director for Access Chapter 2.